Yeah.
Okay, good evening, everybody. This evening we're here with Riaan Salie, who is a writing fellow at African Liberty and is, I suppose, like me, a former left wing radical, as we have been chatting about briefly before the break. And I suppose a good point to start off with over there would be um, how did you see the world and why did that change?
Well, as a typical student activist, you tend to see the world in a very narrow, through a very narrow lens. I think it's born culturally, uh, through your own experiences, through your family's experiences. When you hear someone like Julius Malema speak, don't discount the guy totally because what he's doing is very clever. It's very smart. It feeds into what you see every day. And so someone in the township sees poverty every day. They see lack of property every day. Um, and when they drive out of that township into the suburbs, the the ideas that's been put in their face or have been put out there about white people being these superior constructs of racial suppression um, and segregation is confirmed to a large extent because when you leave the township, get into the suburbs, and all you see, or the majority of what you see, are white individuals. So I too bought into that rather crazy idea about society. And I didn't base any of my opinions based on how big or how small the government is. And that was a very logical reason for why our society looks the way it looks. But that's only in hindsight that I can say, okay, now I understand what are the real reasons for the decay of our society. But to get specifically to your question, um, for me, it was all about race, skin color, us against you. And it was this collectivist perspective of the world that when you get into an environment with other people that look like you, they confirm what you've heard before. And it's not your own ideas. Oftentimes you battle with those ideas, but it gets confirmed so many times that you start to believe the lie. And I started calling this the leftist racist lie. And it is
Mm-hmm.
so embedded in our society and in South African culture. And it is digging deep into, and it primarily stems from millennials. I don't know if you remember the Fees Must Fall movement. Um,
Yes, I do.
I was part of um, the generation that experienced that movement, the destructiveness of that movement. And what it did was it almost validated everything you believed about the world racially because it was being
Mm.
confirmed on such a scale. It first
Yes.
started at
Mm.
Wits, I think, somewhere Rhodes when
Well,
Civil War Rhodes statue.
Roseman's Fall began at UCT in March of 2015, and I was around. I was around for that. I was quite close to the movement, and what you're saying is true. It was ubiquitous. There were no critical voices at all, and so people confirmed one another in a very aggressive and uncompromising fashion.
So it was this thing of when is the movement coming to Stellenbosch? When is the movement coming to all these other places? We need the movement here. But to understand the reasons for education and all its various nuances was just thrown out the door. Nobody was starting a conversation about why is education important or why is it not as important or where does where does this money come from? What are the consequences for students? What are the consequences for society? None of that was there. It was thrown out of the window, and what you had was is this crazy movement or this crazy wave that everyone was just riding, and you started to see many students of different races start joining the movement because they were saying, "Well, we need to stand in solidarity with those oppressed." Um, and you were just jumping on this little bandwagon. And fortunately for myself, I wasn't totally convinced of the tactics of this movement. So I didn't put myself totally into it, but I did buy into its ideas that education should be free, that land should be expropriated. And the funny thing, or the plans that these Marxists have, is that one demand leads to the other, and it causes this chain reaction. So it was
Yes.
free education, and then it became about the land. But I don't know if you remember when Julius Malema was tossed out of the ANC, he started to call for the nationalization of mines, or at the time when he started
Yes.
calling for nationalizing the mines. We need to take the land back. And after he was tossed out for making racist remarks, um, he then started this process of taking back the land, and you started to see land grabs happening at a scale not seen in South Africa. Even the ANC were condemning it, that people shouldn't be occupying land illegally at the time. So
Hmm.
it's all this chain reaction of events. And Julius Malema, part and parcel of that millennial type of, maybe it's a bit later generation or earlier generation, but he fed into that fears and those concerns that the millennial generation brought. And now you see this toxic millennial generation breeding or blowing the flames of destruction to the Gen Zs of the world. But there's an interesting phenomenon happening among the Gen Z generation, is that most of them aren't buying into the socialist idea. Most of them are seeking refuge in voices that are anti-socialist. They want more of capitalism,
You don't
primarily,
say.
primarily
How
because
did you start noticing this?
I'm going to tell you why I say that.
Hmm.
It's because they saw the remnant of cancel culture. Remember, they were the ones experiencing cancel culture. So they were the ones being blocked. They were the ones being shadow banned on all these platforms. They were the ones seeing destruction happen at universities, in the aftermath of the destruction happening at universities. So a lot of them started to not totally buy into this idea that, well, the world is might be systemically racist. And so that's the reason why you see political parties like the EFF who will bottom out at some point in time, because that's their voter base that's come with him from the youth league of the ANC. It's nothing deep. When you consolidate the EFF's numbers and the ANC's numbers, it's the exact numbers that the ANC had prior to the EFF leaving. That was the ANC Youth League support base. So
Yes.
there's nothing phenomenal about the ANC, about the EFF's voter base. There's nothing phenomenal about this rhetoric, this hot button issues of land, and you can't discuss certain events. Um, and why I say the Gen Z again, the Gen Z generation is starting to pull away from this, is because the content I put out, or the political, it's not just on Twitter. Twitter's a much older group. I put content out on TikTok, on Instagram, mostly on Instagram at the moment because it's just too much work to do all of that. But I get a ton of messages from school children and university students that tell me we need people like you in the world. I get from across the world, from the UK, from the USA, a lot from South Africa, that ask me, where can they get involved? Because
Yes.
nobody's been voicing these concerns, and all they've heard is Julius Malema spew his hate on platforms and them being attacked. I mean, they send me screenshots of the comment sections, and these are not like 5 people sending me this. These are thousands of people. On TikTok, I have about almost 20,000 followers. And I get a ton of messages, private messages from young people that are trying to push back against this narrative of whatever systemic. If you can't prove the facts, then say it's systemic. And that's the tactic of the left in South Africa. But it's a very, and you see this among academics, these woke academics. But again, nothing significant, because these woke academics were the millennials that were causing the destruction on campuses 4 years ago.
Yeah.
So there's nothing significant about what they're saying. They said all these
Yes,
lies.
they're still
Left
treading out the same narratives that were flowing around 30, 40 years ago in academia. It's not radical anymore. It's an established position.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, you know it, I know it, but a lot of young people, unfortunately, feel that that is the overwhelming majority sentiment. And what's important to note is, I think Herman Mashaba always speaks about it, even though I don't support his political party, but he
Mm.
always speaks about the missing population, the missing voter. That's pretty important. It's pretty significant to say that, because the overwhelming majority of people in South Africa don't support these left-wing politicians or their ideas, or else they would have voted long ago. They would have joined the elections to give the ANC and the EFF a mandate. And democratically speaking, they don't have an electoral mandate for what they're pushing.
Mm.
They don't have this quote unquote majority. What is the majority? The majority of the few who voted. That's not a mandate by any stretch of the imagination. So young people buy into this idea that, well, most people believe this. They're like, Rian, how can we how can you support, for instance, John Steenhuisen or the DA, when a white person doesn't have most of the support, won't get most of the support? And my
Yeah.
simple answer is that, well, um, the DA and these other parties, there's no evidence to suggest that they don't have the majority support. What I'd actually say is that what people fail to remember is that the DA, even though they've lost voters, still has more support than the EFF electorally. So the
Mm.
DA, even the DA as a small political party, has a bigger mandate, quote unquote mandate, than the EFF has, voter wise. But what is concerning is that we've bought into this racist, or some people have bought into this racist narrative or this racist lie, that if your skin color looks different, then another
Contrasted.
person is
Yeah.
not going to vote for you. And that's not the case. People want freedom, they want jobs, they just want to create a financially stable life for themselves. Most people go to work, come back home, and they don't have time to put the TV on. They don't have time
Yeah.
to read the newspaper, and they don't have time to sit on social media all day. So they don't know about these issues. They don't, quite frankly, care about what the EFF has to say, or other racial stirring individuals in society, in civil society, I have to say, and intellectuals on sitting on ENCA, not knowing what they're speaking about, like some reporters who call themselves journalists but aren't actually. They are left-wing activists sitting in a position of power, trying to use that to spread propaganda. Um, the the interesting thing is that these propaganda tactics, and pivoting a bit, has been used in fascist Germany, and fascism is born out of socialism, and
Mm.
this is the most contentious issue among young people who have bought into this idea of socialism, because they
Yes.
think that socialism is not fascism. They've learned, I don't know where they've learned this lie from.
But it's interesting that you point that out because, from my understanding, ordinary South Africans generally don't care about differences between socialism and fascism.
Mm,
It's that little upper crust that we belong to, the two of us,
mm,
who go to university, who learn these more sort of sophisticated myths that
mm,
people use, like the left-right spectrum, which is a very Western idea.
mm.
Um, but I think anyone who's read any history knows that racial nationalism and socialist economics tend to go hand in hand almost everywhere.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, if you just take Germany, for instance. Um, the Nazi social or the German Socialist Party. That tells you all that you need to know about German socialism and how it developed Hitler's greatest ideas of expropriating all land without compensation, pushing for the nationalizations of banks. He wanted to do away with private wealth, and
Yep.
he labeled the Jews as being greedy capitalists, and that's why they
Yeah.
targeted the Jews. It's exactly the same things that's happening in South Africa, and people don't understand that we're treading down a very dangerous line. But what frustrates me even more is our politicians, even on the side that I support, are too soft about this. Um,
Yes.
Way too soft. But I'll go into that in a bit.
Mm.
I don't know if you wanted to say something. You looked like you wanted to say something.
Oh no, I was just vigorously agreeing with you. I
Oh,
mean, look,
um,
I'm known for. I think I'm known a little bit on Twitter for posting about this little character from Nazi Germany called Max Naumann, and Max Naumann was a Jew who had a small political pressure group called, well, it wasn't that small, but it was called the Association of German National Jews, and he rallied Jews in support of Adolf Hitler.
mm,
And then when things started getting really out of hand, he started showing hesitation for Hitler's program, and he was whisked away to a concentration camp in 1935 and died in 1939. So I think one of the most peculiar proportion of Jews in Central Eastern Europe and the proportion of whites in South Africa are very similar, and the disproportional balance of wealth is very similar, and the urban concentrations are similar,
mm,
um, and so you could have applied a great deal of similar arguments about privilege to Jews back then, which is what was used, albeit in a different form. And so we kind of end up in the situation we're in now, where instead of thinking about, or I mean, you think about how diverse Germany is. You've got various
mm,
different states where they don't really speak the same language. They speak these very different Germanic dialects, and they have to
mm,
communicate in this kind of mutual High German in order to get on. And what we've done in South Africa is we're stripping all of the nations of their characteristics to make them into black people, this strange, amorphous colonial construct, and then make them all speak English. It's
mm.
really, really perverse.
But we don't even need to use Germany as an example of how
No, it's true.
socialism catastrophically failed. Let's just
Mm.
use a very fresh example, or fresh to the African continent. And I won't even go into Zimbabwe. Let's use Tanzania. Tanzania implemented
Oh,
socialism from the outset, immediately after they took over, after the imperial government, or whatever you want to call it. They implemented a
mm.
socialist program from the outset. So they took all the land, they made everyone share the wealth, the redistribution, like what some South Africans want, and they tried it, but it failed miserably. People were
Yeah.
not getting healthcare, not receiving services, and a lot of community members started getting frustrated because they couldn't understand why they couldn't generate any wealth. And so that was perplexing to them, and so the government had to concede that socialism is a failed concept. And so they
Yeah.
had to pivot to basically a liberal democracy. And that's how liberal democracy started to rise in Africa. It's only South Africa, weirdly enough, that's one of the countries moving back towards the system. Other countries in Africa are moving towards democracies and capitalism and pushing for capitalism. Like the AU is actually pushing for more free trade through the new Free Trade Agreement Act. But South Africa seemingly wants to go
Mm.
back to a system of this oppression. But more importantly, is to recognize that even before colonialism, Africa had a system of capitalism. through a wide
Yes.
spread throughout Africa. And that system was brought down by colonialism. And colonialism is not capitalism. Colonialism is a form of cronyism that
Mm.
only benefits those connected to whatever governing authorities there is or are. Um, so this idea that socialism, works anywhere in the world, it's proven in our own continent, on our own continent, that it's failed and governments have had to make concessions.
I think it's interesting that that you're pointing out all of these factors. I mean, one of the so you mentioned the African Union pushing for free trade. Now,
Mm,
my particular view of that would be much like the European Union. It's not for free trade.
mm, mm.
It's for centralization of government across large territories and the consolidation of power. And you can see that much the same in Africa, where they've been talking about having their own internet-wide currency. But as we know from currency unions, it usually destroys markets in various sectors.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you regarding the whole one currency, one Africa thing going on. But it is interesting that they recognize in their own idea of this big government that the only way it's going to function is if there is a free flow and a free movement of things and people. And that is the essence of the free market. So they concede, even in their notion of capitalism, even in their notion of socialism, that capitalism is the way to implement this, which isn't then socialism. But
Mm,
you have these weird arguments being made. Actually, there are no arguments being made on the other side. They just say, "Well, we don't care. We just want to take
yes,
everything because this is my skin color, and you don't belong on the African continent because you
yeah,
don't form part of this social construct that some professor at some university somewhere in his basement formulated and came up with and said, well, world, here is your social construct. And we are all collectivists now. Let's move away from non-racialism that we pushed for so long, for so many years, tried to fight apartheid South Africa with its collectivist ideas. And now, well, let's just go down this dark road of socialism because you know what?
yeah.
Never works out.
I don't think we ever learned, because if you notice, we haven't really gone through expelling the settlers, that phase, that brutal phase that every other African nation went through.
Mm,
So we're still heading towards that.
mm,
Um, and I think it's interesting you brought up colonialism, because one of the definitions that I had, that the one that makes most sense to me, is that it's outsourcing your government to a foreign country,
mm,
right? And there's something very interesting, is watching how policy in Africa is almost entirely designed by a small network of large international um, organizations, which have a very
mm.
peculiar design for sort of consolidation, breaking down of borders. And one of the interesting things that I noticed is, Sustainable Development Goal 10 of the United Nations.
No, no, no.
Well, that's land reform. And you can see recently there was a conference that Thuli Madonsela convened at UCT, where they talked about different plans for how to develop Sustainable Development Goal 10, which is giving disadvantaged communities access to land. And it's just, the language is beautiful, but what it's really saying is, seize the land from the kulaks.
I mean,
That's
just to bring your idea home for those who don't know all these fancy terms or ideas, is basically you are giving all your wealth and everything that you own to the government to control and to decide when you can use it, how you can use it, and if they deem that that you haven't been using it correctly, they will take it away, and then they have the power to take it away. So, economic or redress, or these redress policies aren't redress; they are theft. They are taking away your power, your ability to create wealth for yourself. And so that's why you have the welfare state come in is because the welfare state then validates this idea that we need to be a society of uh, just getting a government handouts, getting things
Yeah.
from the government. So it feeds into this idea of land reform, expropriation without compensation. Let's just all take the land because we need to get something. We need to acquire some sort of property because that's the only way we're going to be successful. And actually, that's not the case. The, the, the fundamental idea or the problem that you need to confront is creating wealth for yourself, creating wealth, sustainable wealth, so that you can start building on it. But now we have a generation being fed this lie, and you have economic policies um, being implemented in society that helps perpetuate that lie. The
Yeah.
one policy that helps to perpetuate that lie is the minimum wage because it traps young people in a very disastrous position that you can't get jobs. Because what people don't understand is the minimum wage removes the only competitive advantage that all young people have, which is no skills. You don't have experience, you don't have know-how of how to use certain things or do certain things. And the only way you are able to get a job is if you start working jobs that one, other people don't want to do, like being a waiter or all these other things that are temporary jobs, or you work for a company and they pay you less than they would pay someone who is fully trained to do a higher position job.
Yeah.
So what happens is that now young people are completely priced out because they can't spend all that time training you. They can't spend all that money training you because they have to pay you a certain salary. So two things happen. Young people are pushed out and people with more experience. I'm sure you've seen how the Twitter mob complains about, well, how can they always ask for experience? How can they always, that's the minimum wage. The minimum wage does that. You need to have experience then because you need to have training so that they don't need to provide all that rigorous training, teaching you how to do Sage Pastel, teaching you how to do systems, Excel, or whatever it is that the company needs you to do, or business, or even a normal trade job teaches you how to do, right?
Yeah.
That's why in Australia you have things like apprenticeships, and young people are the beneficiaries of apprenticeships in Australia. Whereas
Yeah.
in South Africa, we don't have that because, well, in the Western Cape, we have learnerships. That's why the Western Cape's unemployment rate is the lowest in the country by miles because the
Yeah.
Western Cape started pilot programs of training young people to get them to do skills jobs. That's the foundation of any economy. But the socialists implement these things, and I don't know if it's because of ignorance, wild ignorance, that they do with this, or because they are intentionally doing it. I think it's more the intent because of the NDR, the National Democratic Revolution. So they know exactly
Hmm.
what they're doing. They trap young people, and you have a population that is fired up, ready to fight for land because they've been trapped in joblessness, in hopelessness, in economic.
Grant
uh,
dependency.
Exactly. And you have this welfare state that is just growing and growing. And what's happening in South Africa is that you're seeing the bigger the welfare state becomes, the poorer society becomes. Um,
Yeah, and it's interesting because by raising the minimum wage and distributing grants and so on, and maxing out government employment, what they're really meaning is that the only way that you can eat is to go to the government or the unions,
mm,
and it's really insidious, really. I mean,
it is.
I haven't noticed any of the DA politicians really being properly aggressive about this because the ANC's entire program seems to me the most malicious and sinister political program, you know,
Mm,
and before
mm,
you get into the real dictatorship territory, you know.
And it's interesting that you bring up the trade unions as well because um, they are the vehicle of joblessness. They are the
Yeah.
vehicle of economic despair because when the trade unions strike for higher minimum wages, they they are striking for more people being unemployed. That's what a lot of people don't understand is that the trade unions protect actually the interests of corporate South Africa because the more young people get priced out and the more barriers to entry for smaller businesses become, the corporates start to benefit significantly from that because they have a
Yeah.
bigger market share.
Yeah, that's why
So,
Amazon. That's why Amazon has backed the minimum wage everywhere that they function. They lobby
mm,
for it very heavily.
you always see bigger companies backing the minimum wage because they don't really care. They can afford it.
Yeah.
Um, and they benefit from it. They get more profits from it. So they
And have
become
you,
more
yeah,
wealthy.
and have you noticed this with the Great Reset? Everything that's being pushed on this new platform about build back better and all that stuff. They're getting rid of local restaurants. They're getting rid of shopping centers. Everything's going to be delivered to you,
Mm.
and so everything's going to be centrally held by large international corporations whose interests are formulated as general policy by the United Nations, who then form the basis for, who then fund all of your universities and make sure that that's where all of your most talented students go if they're looking for the best internships, so that they become the entire frame, the entire lens through which the whole of the global economy and political system is viewed. It's in the interests of multinational corporations and international governance. And the
I
thing
mean,
is that I think the thing is that um, sorry, I think I've spent too much day on Twitter today.
yeah.
But um, the one thing that I'd be interested to hear from you is, considering how much of this stuff overlaps South Africa with the general sort of global governance model. Um, how would you sort of see a way around this? Practically speaking,
Well,
we can see it all sort of eats away at things gradually. How would you see a way out?
Well, I don't particularly. I get your
Mm.
very well educated point about the Great Reset. I'm not very particularly deep into that, so just putting it out there. But your
Okay.
point, your point is a good one. That the way out of this, there are three ways, three specific things that South Africa needs to do specifically to start generating wealth on a scale not seen in our country before. The first thing is to ensure that private property rights are protected. That is sacrosanct. It's non-negotiable. The second thing is to im- to improve the ease of doing business in South Africa. So that's removing regulation after regulation after red tape. Some of those regulations include BE, etc. All these type of bureaucratic things that businesses have to go through. And the last thing is to ensure that the rule of law in South Africa is significantly protected. Now, what those three factors do is it makes South Africa more economically free. And the report I'm referring to, if anyone's interested in it, is the
Mhm.
Index of Economic Freedom by the Heritage Foundation. Um, and those are the three factors that it basically compiles for every country in the world. It measures them on it, and it measures how economically free they are. And South Africa ranks one of the worst in the world. They rank we rank lower than China on that
Yeah.
index. So that's a major indictment. And it's then if you look at that in the context of our economy, it shouldn't be a surprise that our economy is tanking so severely. But more importantly, is that South Africa's performance for the rule of law is one of the worst in Africa. And that was quite shocking for me to learn because you'd always think, well, South Africa, look at South Africa, it should be one of the best. But actually, South Africa is not one of the best in Africa in terms of other measures. So the rule of law in South Africa, what the rule of law means is the protection of citizens against overreaching government. Now, a lot of
Mm.
politicians in South Africa and wannabe commentators on Twitter don't understand what the rule of law is. And they confuse this with a concept called law and order, a concept Donald Trump uses very often in his tweets. Um, and so, because we perform so badly for all three of that, our economy is weak. But if our economy started to pivot towards performing better on those scales,
Mm.
ensuring that the ease of doing business is significantly better, we will improve the quality of life in the country. Within a few years, you would see drastic changes happening in South Africa. But people always discount South Africa's um, performance in terms of capitalism. Now, not anecdotal, one statistical or scientific point that I could make is that between 1994 and 2007, South Africa's economy performed the best it's ever performed. We were one of the best emerging markets in the world, but that was primarily because Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki made a commitment to, albeit not as much free market, but more free market than what we have right now. They made a commitment to that, and you saw the black middle class in South Africa increase at its highest rate that it's ever increased. Um, and after 2007, when Julius Malema helped oust Thabo Mbeki and insert Jacob Zuma into the presidency, that's when all the trouble started. So the socialists would tell me, well, Riaan, it was the economic recession that caused this decline. No, it wasn't. The economic recession is a mere external shock to what's happening in South Africa already.
Yes,
So
because you
when
can see
external,
we didn't actually get hit by that recession until a couple of years
mm,
later because we're further down the value chain
mm,
internationally. And actually, we got a minor boost because assets flowed into metals and other reasons.
mm.
You know, we were saved a little bit of the bite there. But you're talking about sort of South Africa's performance. I mean, Dagbreker just asked a question. He asked, so if you consider the Pareto distribution with a capitalist model and the free flow of capital in an open African market, then would the wealth of Africa not then accumulate in South Africa?
That would only happen. That would only happen if South Africa was on solid ground already. This is
Yeah.
this is the fallacy with that point is that it is prefaced on the notion that Africa is going to inherently perform better for doing that.
Yeah.
When in actual fact, what it does is um, things like that can only work if countries are already performing significantly well and well off. And then those free flowing and all those things will
Hmm.
work because you have the respect of the rule of law, you have private property, you have wealth growing. So you don't have the burdens of other societies falling on the shoulders of um, better, more well-off societies, and so it perpetuates the cycle of poverty. But if South Africa were to be part of something like that, and the trends we are seeing in Africa, the totalitarian trends happening in Africa, this continent will descend into the biggest civil war continent on the face of the planet because you have so many interests to balance. Everyone wants power. All these political movements, terror groups want power in Africa. Um, so you don't have a civil society that necessarily buys into the notion of statehood and what is the state, what constructs the state. We don't agree on systems. So for that to work, we would have to have widespread agreement on this is the way we're going to do it, and we are going to have legitimately free societies. Because if you don't have free societies, you can't basically have a successful system under that. But more importantly, actually, it goes against the grain of what these new fascists push. That they want to secure power. They need to consolidate power and control industries. They won't have any power if Africa was an open Africa. So it does feed into this idea that it's actually not in their interest, but it's more in their national interest to push and lobby for this. Um, so South Africa won't be inherently more successful because South Africa is performing extremely bad. Other African countries are not doing well either.
Mm.
So we don't have prosperous societies across Africa, primarily because of conflict in interest. You have external actors, internal actors. You have people meddling in the affairs of Africa. Um, Societies trying to change certain things in Africa, other Africans pushing back against other Africans. We don't have a widespread consensus on what constructs are African. So all these intellectual ideas conflict with each other, and it breeds the conditions for a very extremely volatile society. So South Africa would be worse off in that system at the moment. Um, the only reason why Europe could have some semblance of prosperity while implementing a system of free trade and all these free movements is because the European nations uh, were inherently free. They came out of a time of so much socialism and government intervention into the economies. They moved totally away from it. I mean, the new generations are trying to take them back to it now, which is quite sad. But you see the
Mm.
the fall of Greece. You see the fall of Spain, and all these countries. Crimea is being annexed by Russia. So that whole project is basically going up in smokes. Brexit was
Oh yes, and
the
now the Dutch are even threatening to leave now. So
it's not going to work if those countries that are already free don't agree on certain things. Um, what is Africa going to look like in a similar environment? It would be hot politics every day, and we would have no security over anything going on in Africa,
yeah,
in our various countries. So we'd lose ourselves. We don't even know who we are as a country at the moment. We can't identify with certain things. Many people are, or some, there's a faction of people in our society rejecting the Rainbow Nation. There is no such thing as the Rainbow Nation. Um,
mm.
I mean, it's clear as daylight that it is a rainbow nation. Whether you want to acknowledge it or not, it exists. We
You know,
have
whether
different
the colors are still touching or not, they are there.
they are there. We are different, but that doesn't necessarily have to mean that there are different racial groups that we have to act different. It just recognizes the melting pot of cultures in South Africa that we came from an extremely divisive past. That we come from a past that highlighted our differences so well. Really, they told us that we were so different from each other, and that we need to treat each other differently. And it recognizes that that happened. So it is paying homage to that painful past and saying we need to recognize that past. Um,
Mm.
we need to say that the people who died in that era, who died during apartheid regime, or whenever totalitarian governments or authoritarian governments were in power, we need to memorialize that. We need to remember that. That's part
Mm.
of our history. Um, and
Yeah.
it's actually sad that South Africa doesn't have that kind of history. I mean, in the United States, you see things like um, specific days being widely celebrated, heroes, icons that fell during very hard times being, um, put on a pedestal and say, this day goes to remembering this specific individual. South Africans don't really have that, particularly because our government, the type of plans they want to implement, doesn't cater for that. But
Mm.
the simple day we could use that has lost its meaning in South Africa is the 16th of December. I'm sure you are very well educated on what the 16th of December is, where it
Yeah,
came from.
I think a lot of people are. I'd be interested to hear what your take on the matter is.
South Africa is based, I argue that South Africa's entire foundation can be traced back to that fatal day. That's why it is such an important day in our history, um, of what happened, the conflict that happened, and how South Africans, or at the time, various groups clashed with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were three name changes that happened that led to the Day of Reconciliation. The first name, it was the Dingaan's Day. The second name was the Day of the Vow, and then it was changed to the Day of Reconciliation. And that day spurs from conflict that happened between the Zulus and the Boer population,
Yes.
or the groups, the various groups that trekked. And they were trading land. The one sold the land to the other, and then the other one attacked the land, or killed those people who bought the land. And the other group came in and said, "Well, you killed our people," and then they started a big war. Um, that's
Mm.
basically, not getting into all the details of it.
Yeah.
That's the essence of the day. And what Nelson Mandela's administration did was it said that we need to recognize this day because it is a significant day in South African history, and we need to bridge the divide. And that's the foundation of our of the reconciliation project that happened in South Africa.
Mm.
Um, Leaders from those groups recognize that we need to bridge this divide, to come together and to see each other not as different, but as all South Africans. And
Yeah.
we need to leave that past behind. We are no longer those people making the same mistakes over and over. So by forgetting a day like that, we forget the essence of what South Africa is built on.
Yeah.
And very interesting, a lot of people don't understand that history because you can tie that into land, ownership of land in the country. And not
Mm.
to get into that, but there are certain ideas floating around that all land in South Africa was owned by a specific group of individuals. And when you
Mm-hmm.
trace that history, you go into the merits of that argument.
Yeah.
And
There's a reason they draw that line at 1913. It's so
mm,
that only they can address those matters. And I've noticed there's very little attention being paid to things that happened in the Cape. Like District 6 is still not a settled issue
mm,
after all these years. And it seems to me to be the simplest to settle because the names are recorded, the property and the plots are recorded.
mm,
Do you know? It would be much easier to settle that matter than almost any other land matter, and yet it's the one that's been put most on the back burner.
mm,
And while you're talking about the Day of the Vow, I thought it was interesting that one of the first speeches that Ramaphosa made as president was to declare Dingane, who went back on his word and murdered the people who he signed a deal with,
mm.
a peace deal with. He lauded him as a struggle hero, as the archetypal struggle hero of the nation. So
I didn't know that.
I
I
thought that
didn't
was
know that.
very significant.
When did you make the
Um,
speech?
20 I think it was actually, it wasn't in his first year in government. I think it was the middle of last year actually. Must look it up. I can send the link to you. But yeah, I mean, one of the things before we get too stuck into the sort of nasty animosity that we're dealing with,
Mm,
I thought um, you brought up an interesting point before we came on air. You mentioned Musi Maimane, and you mentioned how a lot of members of the DA ended up backing a lot of the policies that fall within sort of fuzzy zone of things which support the National Democratic Revolution,
mm,
and particularly like universal basic income and various other sort of economic things. And I thought it would be interesting. What do you make of that? Where do you think the all of that comes from? Because they're supposed to be, at least nominally, a liberal
mm,
party.
mm. I think a lot of, especially from the DA side, when you've seen these members exit in the DA in fiery fashion, they suddenly became brave overnight. They weren't brave enough
Mm,
to speak in their party. They weren't brave enough to convince people, to persuade people. but coming out so strong. But anyway, I genuinely think a lot of them have good intentions. Um, so they would fall into that group of maybe not knowing as much as they claim to know about perhaps South African history, the history of the NDR, where it came from, why was it put in place, um, and what are the implications of socialist-like policies on
Mm.
society. And I think that they truly believe that it does help the poor. Um, because they do claim to be liberals and they do reject a lot of the things that the ANC or the EFF or other groups in South Africa push for. So they reject
Mm.
those things. But on the other hand, they seem to want to concede, yes, maybe something needs to be done about the injustices of the past. So I think they're genuinely coming from a good place in that they are pushing for something they think genuinely works. When in actual fact and reality, when you dig deeper and go into the information, you go into the facts, it doesn't work. It fails time and again. And the burdens that it creates on society, it might not create that burden immediately, but
Mm.
over time, and when South Africa is put under pressure, it will expose itself slowly in incremental steps, like it is during the COVID-19 pandemic. All these ideas that are actually very socialist, but for the sake of South African pundits, they don't think that everything is just socialist. Um, so it is left leaning, perhaps.
Yeah, it's become the water that we swim in, to the point that no one can imagine a system where we do without it. They think it would be morally wrong to
Not to.
reduce the amount of government intervention.
Mm. But in actual fact, the reverse is true. If you
Yeah.
reduce government intervention, like shown during the period of 1994 to 2007, anyone with an internet connection can Google that period and check out the economic performance of South Africa, the unemployment levels,
Mm.
the growth of the black middle class in South Africa. All these factors um, were skyrocketing at a time when the free market was allowed more room in the country. And after that, when Jacob Zuma got inserted by Julius Malema and some other members, the tanking and the pillaging of the South African economy started to happen. And they tend to blame it on state capture. It's not state capture, it's more government intervention into the economy because it breeds the conditions for state capture to happen. State capture is not a new thing. It happened in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Zimbabwe, in North Korea. It's happening in all these places. That's why you saw the Soviet Union crumble under the weight of state capture, of government intervention. Um, so they don't understand that these policies and government intervention, like things like UBI, Universal Basic Income, isn't a benefit to the poor. It locks them into poverty, it keeps them dependent on the government, and it ruins the economy in the long run. Maybe in the short run, it seems like a good idea to just give
Yeah.
everybody something, and it's perhaps this utopian world that we want to paint. We do want to get rid of poverty. Everyone wants that. If nobody wants people to live a struggling life, not even those on the other side, surprisingly, that don't want government intervention. We don't want poverty. We don't want people in it. I mean, to me, it is abhorrent to drive past a township because I can just imagine how single moms or dads or whoever wake up every day and force themselves to do the most extraneous work for little money, come back and only provide very little for their families. That to me is the biggest injustice that can ever happen in our country at any time, any given point in time in our history. That's a very bad thing.
Yeah.
And I argue for less government intervention because I recognize that that system is going to get those people out of that situation because
Yeah.
it's going to stimulate economic growth. It's going to make people economically independent, not dependent on the state. and
Yeah.
what Musi Maimani is doing. You know, if Musi Maimani and his plans were so successful, then why did he shed one of the biggest voter bases that could ever be shed as a leader of a political organization, regardless of which political organization? If that was the ANC, they would have thrown him out immediately after that election. They wouldn't
Yeah.
have even waited and spared him all the niceties. So for the media, who've been all anti Maimani for so long, to now suddenly laud him as this high and mighty savior of South African society and inequality, is disingenuous, because
Yeah.
they were the ones fighting Maimani tooth and nail when he was pushing those same policies in the DA for the 2019 election. If they
Yeah.
want all those socialist things, why didn't they vote for the DA?
Yeah.
So they hypocrites. They're people who've never voted for the DA. They probably never will, and not unless their minds are changed. Um, Pushing a narrative, continually pushing this narrative about the DA. These are the things I
This
delete
is
about.
so. This narrative you talk about. So I notice you're a little bit closer to these debates because I've stepped back from this particular area. All I tend to notice nowadays is that there are people who will castigate the DA and denigrate them as something that is inconceivable to vote for, and only reprehensible people would consider it. Um, and at the same time, they'll recognize that everything in South Africa is wrong
Mm,
and will never come out and say who they vote for.
mm. You know the interesting thing about the DA, maybe just to provide more context for why people, or of why I started believing, or when I started believing in them.
Mm,
Um, because I didn't particularly like the DA. I had the same ideas about the DA as many on the other side of the aisle had. But after I started discovering that free markets bring prosperity, right?
mm.
I started to say, well, before I vote, maybe it's probably a good thing to read policies of political parties, because I never did that. I just went off the whole politics wherever it's playing itself out, and you see something happening in
Soap
parliament.
opera.
Exactly. Let's vote for a political party making great strides in parliament, because look, they're the only ones bringing change. So that was the sentiment that I had as well. But when I started realizing that less government intervention, more free markets, and I read the DA's policy, even though it wasn't perfect at the time, they did speak a lot about deregulation of the business environment. The- I think they've spoken about this consistently for a very long time, to remove certain barriers in the business environment, because that will free up a lot of jobs. And so I started to realize that perhaps the DA really has good intentions. And then I started to ask myself, well, why is the Western Cape performing significantly better than other provinces? I've heard it so many times. I lived in Durban, so I know this to be true. When you
Oh,
arrive in Cape
yeah,
Town,
yeah.
when you arrive off those steps of the aeroplane, or however you get in Cape Town, you feel like you've stepped into another country, regardless of where you are in the Western Cape. It's a different place with a different feel. Um, and that was true many years ago when I first arrived in Cape Town. And it is still true today, because a lot of people say that Cape Town is significantly more different than South Africa. But that's just like an anecdotal point. Um, but
Yes.
you see the minimal what the minimal potential of what the Western Cape or South Africa could achieve if it had a truly free government, or was free from government. The DA can't implement all the policy it wants to implement, because it has to fall under the guise of national policy. So it can't even do to its extreme of what it wants to do. So it has to operate within this confines of national government. Another point of how they cast the DA is they look at townships, for instance, and they say, well, look at the inequality in the Western Cape. The
Yes.
inequality is so bad in the Western Cape. The townships are performing bad. I would implore anybody to go Google search the ward councillors of those townships, and you take a look for yourself which political parties are running it. Because
One of the, Mhm.
if you had the DA, for instance, right, this is political suicide, by the way. If you had the DA run those townships, despite it being run by the ANC councillors, run it like they would run their own wards, run it as efficiently and perfectly, the ANC would slap that up as a victory of ANC superiority, ANC policy. Look what the ANC is doing, so much progress in these areas.
Yeah.
That, first of all, is political suicide. So the only way many areas in the DA, in the Western Cape, can get out of poor service delivery, poor living conditions,
Is
is
to
to
see the
start voting,
difference.
for the party running the suburbs, because they the suburbs don't maintain itself. You don't just wake up one day and everything is perfect. People have to work here. A lot of people complain here more than anything else. Will complain about the smallest things and cast the government in such a bad light. Look at the DA is not really doing, etc., etc. So a lot of work is put into areas like this, and a lot of work will be put into areas like in uh, poorer communities in the Western Cape. So that's another political scoring point that they use. Another one is they use, well, look at the violence, the murder rate, um, the the alarming gang violence in the Western Cape. It is so bad and so pervasive. It must be a form of systemic racism. That's why the DA is a racist party.
Oh, but then they don't know the details, do they? I mean, I
Yeah.
know you. I know. I don't know if you watched a bit of the. I don't know what if you watched a bit of the interview from yesterday with Jean-Pierre Smith.
Mhm.
So he spoke a lot about the sort of structural connection and organization of land invasions by the
Mm,
ANC.
mm,
What we didn't have time to get into, and what I will most likely be inviting him back on to talk about, is the gangs, because the
mm,
ANC has actively intervened, including arresting officials, in order to prevent the Western Cape police services from cleaning up the gang violence
mm,
in the coloured areas.
mm. I mean, the police, even the police, if you look at just take the police, that's a national competency. We This isn't some form of federal government happening in the Western Cape. The national government dictates how police is funding, and they're stripping away billions for SAA right now. So
Mm.
crime is probably going to get worse. I'm not saying that police intervention decreases crime, but it does go a long way to stem the flow of petty crimes. There's a concept, a theory called the broken windows theory, and it
Oh
speaks about
yes, yes.
the reduction of smaller things will lead to a reduction of bigger events over
Mm.
time if it is consistently applied. That's exactly what happens in our society. But on the other hand, the police do play an important role in stemming that flow of criminal activity. So being severely underfunded, not having training. Um, you see how the JMPD is treating people in Johannesburg. You have all these videos almost daily on YouTube, wherever you look, how police services are treating ordinary South Africans because there is a lack of training, there's a lack of skills in our services that we receive. So all these things are an indictment of the ANC government, not the DA-led Western Cape. And I'm not some, as you know, I'm not some fanboy of the DA. I wasn't always with the DA,
Mm.
but we need to be honest about the factual things that is the facts about our society is that the DA is performing significantly better than the ANC government. They
Yeah,
are
it's at the
delivering,
moment, as poor as they are comparatively, they're kind of the only option out there.
and they're using, and they're operating under under the conditions of national government policy, and yet they find a way to perform significantly. And significantly is probably a small word to use to describe what the DA is busy doing in the Western Cape. It is so good to know that, even though there's a thing that happens in the Western Cape, among a lot of, well, a huge array, a diverse range of students or individuals that I know, is that who support the ANC, for instance. They might vote the ANC or they vote the EFF, but they vote the DA provincially. And they always tell me the DA is just running the Western Cape better, and I wouldn't be able to live under the conditions of a place that I came from. So I would rather keep the DA in power here while voting the ANC national government, because I
I've
believe in the
noticed this a lot, but that seems to me kind of illogical. Surely, if you know one party is better, why not vote for them?
that's the
People, what is their reasoning?
that's a sentiment that is widespread throughout Cape
Mm.
Town. They would vote national government, ANC or EFF, for instance, and they would vote DA. But I think it just, instead of being like these highly, well, people who read about policy and the implications of government intervention, they don't really care about that. But they only vote based on they are trying to serve the interests of my people, for instance. They don't really know the implications of a more state intervention or less state intervention. Um, they don't really care, but what they do understand is they're seeing the outcomes in the Western Cape, and a lot of people in the Western Cape aren't originally from the Western Cape because they come here finding jobs. A lot of people I know who
Mm.
studied at university come back to the Western Cape because this is the only place they can get a job in the industry that they actually studied for. Because there are jobs, there's a growing business environment in the Western Cape. And it sounds like, I'm overstating how well the Western Cape is doing, because 20% unemployment is still not very good. Like, I'm not saying that that is good, but it's significantly better than the rest of the country. Um,
Mm.
but I don't think that they're making particularly intellectual points about the different parties. It's more rather the sentimental value that those political organizations play within their households, or where
Yeah,
they come
it's sort
from.
of like,
Where, like,
who are you going to believe, me, if your eye, me, or the or your own eyes? You know, that kind of thing.
but it's a thing of, many people have told me that they knew where I was politically many years ago or a couple of years ago. So they say that, you know what, if you have switched, if you have changed your mind so drastically over a few years, we are willing to go with you on that route because we knew where you came from. We knew that you weren't just this right wing or whatever that people say at times that you are. Um, I came from a past where I was fighting all these causes and trying to achieve justice. But that's why I say that even those in the DA that have moved out of the DA are perhaps maybe doing it for genuine reasons. They just don't understand the issues as much as they think they understand the issues.
Yeah.
Um, and that sounds quite cocky to say it that way, but it's the reality, because when you go toe to toe with someone in a debate, on an issue, you would start to find out what they really know about the issue. Because it's easy to say, well, you believe in economic redress because it's going to bring more equality and more prosperity to the country. That's in itself, okay, it's a statement. You've made a statement, but you can't back it up with empirical evidence. And then they pivot to, well, it's systemic racism because they can't bring in any evidence. There is no evidence to support their claim. Um,
The other one, that's an interesting one, because that's also a big point that people use in their favor. They talk about systemic racism, and it's
mm,
such an amorphous term. I still remember a time when we used to talk about racism as meaning race hatred, And now racism means, well, any system in which white people are even slightly more rich on average than any other group.
Mm.
And
You know,
it's very bizarre.
to just clarify to everybody who might see this what racism is. Racism is discriminating against someone based on the color of their skin. Period.
Mm.
There's nothing more to say about it. There are no social constructs that you need to dwell into. There's no intellectual point that you need to make. Um, the point I was making to another individual that has, whatever trouble they have in their life is that there are various studies that you can go look at. Researchers from archaeological researchers, scientists have looked at the origins of society, of humanity. And I don't know if you've read the book Sapiens, but um,
Hariri's book.
yes, the new research brought out it debunks a lot of the things in that book. So it's quite a dangerous thing to go read because if you read it, you would accept that as scientific truth, and it's not entirely so. But anyway, getting into the facts about race is that they trace virtually every ethnic or whatever you are racial group back to the Sand People, all the way to the Cape right back many years ago, and a divergence in DNA happened between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago that started humanity. And so you saw that divergence was discovered in the Bantu people who then migrated southeast from all the way from Kenya downwards and colonized various parts of Africa and then
Mm.
eventually South Africa. Those are the things that people don't know. But
Yeah,
that
yeah,
racial idea then started to formulate based on geographical location. So we weren't
mm.
called Africans because you are a darker skin color. You were called African because you came from a specific geographical location.
Yeah,
That's
because
why,
Africa had many races. I mean, as we can
yeah,
see, Somalis look completely different from, Central East Africans who are pitch black, and then people from Rwanda, totally unique looking, people from West Africa, very different looking. The Berbers in North Africa, very pale, could pass for Italians. And then
and
you look at the Queer and the San, totally different from any other racial group
the
again.
funny thing was that this individual said that if you were born today in Asia, would you be Asian? And I said yes. And they said, no, you can't be Asian. And I said,
Yeah,
you don't understand the where racial or where these sorts of geographical locations play into your identity. So
yeah.
now we have a
It's
modern
indelible.
civilization
I will be seen
where
as a European for the rest of my life, despite the fact that my family have been in the Cape for hundreds of years. And I even have, well, if I go back far enough, a couple of queer ancestors. And I mean, I had an interview a few days ago last week, with Mansell Upham, and he spoke very extensively about connections and the ties between all of the different groups in the Cape, and
mm,
their intermingling. And it sort of doesn't matter to people because in the political realm nowadays, because they're not interested in history for any other reason than what it can mean to them, how it can justify their prejudices.
mm. Yeah, and I mean, because we're in a modern civilization that has moved cultures, you've moved to different geographical locations. That's what you are then called because we live in a different age, we live in a different time. It has nothing to do with race, racial, whatever you want to call it. It has everything to do with geographical location. That's an easy way
Mm.
to identify where you come from, who you are, what are the type of things you ascribe to. But today we live in this cosmopolitan world where one person can live in two places in the same year or at the same time because they have a house in New Zealand and they have a house in um, the United States somewhere. So we live in a different kind of world, in a world where before we couldn't travel around, we couldn't do all the things that we are doing right now. That's why even a white person in South Africa can identify as an African because we live in a different world. We're in a different time. That's not the same anymore as what it was 10 years ago, or not even 10 years ago, like decades ago, when you were called based on your geographical location. So it's all to do with identity, where you come from. And if you were born in South Africa and you say that you are South African, then you are most assuredly a South African, regardless of the color of your skin. And this is a point that I don't negotiate on. When someone pushes this point or this narrative, you have to be extremely factual because they will go down this rabbit hole of explaining to you what is a racial construct and biology, and you can debunk the biology and the geographical one in the
But
same
have you
point.
noticed it's always two things? They'll say on the one hand that it's socially constructed, and then they'll tell you that it's genetically indelible.
Mm,
They'll think those completely opposite things at the exact same time. So
mm,
they'll say race isn't real, and that's why we have to discriminate on the basis of race.
mm.
And it's marvelously Orwellian. It's just it's completely disgusting. But I think that people can be so transparently dishonest is remarkable.
I mean, it literally just rhetoric, and it just feeds into this fear mongering and this hate because it's easy to focus on negative aspects of society. Even on Twitter is just this, I don't know, like this platform for hate,
It doesn't
continual
have to
hate.
be. It doesn't
It
have to be. Have you
doesn't
noticed
have
I
to
never
be.
get into fights on that platform? I don't get
But
into fights
Twitter is a
because I
negative
block
space.
anyone who I might fight with.
No, I don't block people. Twitter is
Mm,
just a cesspool of negativity from every side. It doesn't
yeah,
matter which side of the political spectrum you're on. If you're not tweeting something negative, you're
yeah,
probably not going to get a reaction from it. Unless you're Gary Vee or some motivational speaker that's very prominent. You're not going to. That's the fact. People
yeah.
want negativity. That's why we gossip, because we are inherently negative beings. We are pessimistic, from the outset. So we feed that, and we give it these feedback loops, and then we replicate it continuously. So
Mm,
negativity on negativity, we see other people doing it, gaining traction. That's why you see a phenomenon where individuals would post about their parent who died of this illness, and you genuinely feel sorry for that. You like it or whatever, and you see it gets like 100,000 interactions on a post, and then you go to their timeline and they're posting jokes like afterwards, and then you wonder, like, oh, hold up, like if you are busy in a crisis, if your relative just passed away, if someone so near, dear, close to you, like you wouldn't have time for Twitter, right? But
mm,
go take a look at these accounts that are posting these stories, and not all of these stories are lies. A lot of them are the truth, but the lie runs parallel with the truth. So, in order for a lie to be really good, it needs to have some truth to it.
yeah.
But that happens, and it feeds this negative feedback loop. And we see it happening in politics as well. If you're not tweeting something, if you're not like anti ANC today, it is, nothing. Like you haven't made a contribution on Twitter for the day. If you didn't say something very bad against the ANC, like they've stolen so much money, then people don't flood or to reaffirm this thing. So that's why Twitter is
Mm,
such a negative space, and it is not reality.
mm,
If it was reality, the EFF would be the governing party by an overwhelming majority. It's not the real world. It's a fictitious world made up of
mm.
bots and trolls and people who hide behind anonymous accounts who won't show their face, but they're very brave to state the opinions. But They won't tell you who they are or where they are from or put a picture of themselves. They're not brave enough to do that. Um,
In
but
some
the
places,
thing
in
is,
some cases, I will, out of charity, I would say, in some cases, that's actually necessary. There are people who, the things that even they believe in honestly,
mm,
could get them into extremely severe trouble in real life.
mm,
Increasingly nowadays, when we target each other offline for what's said online.
yeah,
So I
yeah,
would
yeah.
think that for those of us who have our face out there,
Mm,
we obviously have to be fairly cautious about what we say, even if we earnestly mean it.
mm,
Things that don't fit into prescribed narratives might, it can be dangerous.
mm. I mean, it's a dangerous place to be on. And
Mm,
if you don't have a reason to be on Twitter, then don't be on Twitter because
yeah.
your life is going to become extremely, or you're going to see things in a much more negative, through a much more negative lens than what you previously
Mm.
had you not been on Twitter. But it's like, if you recognize that Twitter's just like not real, or it is real, there is reality to it. I'm not saying it's completely fake. But once you realize that that's not ordinary life, that if ordinary South Africans get along with each other, you can have coffee and uh, like have good interactions with people in the coffee shop, regardless of race. No one thinks about you are drinking a bigger mug of coffee, so therefore you are systemically this and that. You are
Oh, you didn't spend enough
so
time in observatory, did you?
no, 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 I didn't. I didn't. I must admit I didn't. But
Yeah.
you just have a much more loving society as opposed to this Twitter universe that is so hateful and vengeful and bitter to each other. And it comes from all sides. It's not just one side that is like hateful towards the other. You just have people wrecking others
Mm.
because they made a mistake on TV. Like they did something and then you'd have people using that.
Yeah, but that's I think that's the price you pay. I mean, if you're in Hlanhla Nene and you eat too much taxpayers' money and then you fall through the chair on SABC2, I think you deserve a bit of laughter, don't you?
I think it helps your spirit if you laugh more, but you just like even funny moments become so negative, and I'm
Yeah,
just laugh like it's really genuinely funny.
yeah.
We don't need to cultivate this negative society, but I mean,
No, you're right. That's what I mean. Like, for example, I think one of the things that I try to do every now and again is to try and post something either positive or just interesting. And so, like yesterday, I mean, like I posted a couple of things like little shots from this illustrated copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and like
you should post on Instagram instead if you want to post anything
yeah, yeah, no,
positive.
you're right. But I just Instagram doesn't click with me. I think I'm too boomerish at heart. But one thing that got a lot of tweets today, for example, is I just posted shots of me making pancakes instead of posting about politics,
Oh yeah, yeah,
and
but
that got that actually got a lot of feedback, and I was quite pleasantly surprised.
I was like I looked at Twitter quite a bit today, obviously because of the election.
Hmm.
But I was just like, all these takes, like, where do they come from? How do you formulate a prediction? Like, my goodness, they're so cringe. Like, the one person is justifying the electoral college is going to look like this because this and this and this, and the other one's attacking him because why are you saying this when Biden says that, and you're not saying this when Trump says that, and etc. etc. It got like
Trying to
it
catch a chart in hypocrisy. What's the
this,
point?
this clueless bait and switch of like, your take wasn't good. No one's, I don't think anyone has a justified take regarding the US election. Like, none of us can truly say we know. So, like, for others to attack another person because of it, like, whatever.
Hmm.
But it became this pundit, elitist cesspool of lies that happened. And they all
Hmm.
got caught out in it because the polling data didn't match what was actually happening on the ground. And they started to panic a bit because what they've been preaching for so long, the disenfranchised political punditry of South Africa, which is utterly repulsive, because they got Brexit wrong, they got the Tory landslide wrong, They got the reaffirming of Brexit totally wrong. Then they got 2016 totally wrong. And now they were praying that maybe the fifth time they would get something right, hedging all their weight on a statistical anomaly of perhaps at a point in time, if we keep saying the same thing, we are going to be right. There is nothing smart about you predicting an election on the same basis. 2016, they made the same predictions. They were wiped from the face of the earth. Their political commentary went through the walls. And I'm not even talking about US political commentary. I'm speaking about South Africans. Those prominent Twitterati that are on Twitter making
Oh, the
predictions.
ones who said like Mbali and Tuli would like smash John Steenhuisen. I actually slightly believed that because I was thinking, well, the game is rigged because um, you're not allowed to be for non-racialism in South Africa. You know what I mean?
But I mean more. I do get what you're saying, but I mean more these. I don't want to mention names. That sounds speaking in circles a little bit. Um,
Okay, no,
but
no, no.
they,
Just refer
they,
indirectly as you
they,
need to.
they speak about the US election, or they would speak about Brexit in such a pompous, elitist way that they just
Uh,
become so. You see how clueless they are about what's happening on the ground, like Brexit, for instance. Nobody saw that coming. But when Brexit was happening, I firmly believed in my heart of hearts that Brexit was going to happen. Um, but I was obviously like, I was seeing the polls and the data, and I was like, it's not going to happen, but it would be nice if it did happen because we need to move away from these toxic systems. Because I watched a lot of EU debates, I was keeping up with what was happening in the EU and how the EU impacts, because I was in the debating world at the time. And we
mm,
debated a lot about the EU's inefficiency or what the EU is doing right and wrong. And so I did believe that personally, the UK should leave the European Union, right? There's no point for them to be there. But anyway, I didn't make any predictions. I didn't go on a tangent about, this thing and this liberal democracy needs this constitutional balance, and these constitutional balances need to be respected totally. And you can't say these things and all these elitist perspectives about Brexit. I was just like, it's the right thing to do. And that's what
yeah.
a lot of political commentators in South Africa get so fundamentally wrong, is that they aren't identifying with the people on the ground. They don't know what people genuinely feel like. In
Mm,
2015, when Donald Trump came out like a Russian wind, I was like, I want more of this in politics because this is honesty. He speaks his mind. He does what he says he's going to do. Um, he holds no bars, and I like that. Just from a personal level, there was no political analysis of what was happening with the situation, and
yeah.
to a large extent, I credit my my political perspective changing primarily because of Donald Trump. Um, he was the one that woke me up to the realities of how the world is working and the implications of what governments are doing with constitutions and democracy. Now, he might not have said it in that eloquent speech, but there was something that changed inside of me to say that I can no longer support the far left because I was to an extent on that far left prior to 2015. And when Donald Trump came out and everyone was calling him a racist, I decided, let me go watch the tape. Let me go watch the thing. And at the time, you're so radical that you don't even want to watch people because you're like, I don't
Yeah,
agree
you
with
feel that kind of.
it.
Mm,
And I was like, I was waiting for the racist remark and I couldn't hear it. And that's when it clicked that maybe the people who were saying these things have actually been lying to me for so long. And that was my, how does everyone say, your red pill moment. That was my moment that I decided that I can no longer support the radical left. I was totally in on land expropriation without compensation, all of these things. Give us national health care. Why don't you want to make education totally free? I was all on that jazz. And then 2015 happened. and then I started to read a lot more about political things, or read about the implications of economic policy. What are the real implications on the ground? And then I started looking at case studies of uh, the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, looking at Tanzania, looking at Zimbabwe. Why is it so coincidental that Zimbabwe implements the same system as Venezuela and then fails? So, like all those things, I had to look at for myself, and I realized, Donald Trump actually helped me um, to realize that, I don't think if he didn't come along, I don't think I would have changed my political ideas. I think I
Mm-hmm.
still would have been on the other side and argued for expropriation and all these things. And to me, it is so disingenuous of libertarian commentators in South Africa to say that Donald Trump is actually a fascist and a totalitarian,
Yeah.
authoritarian, because aren't libertarians the ones that push for low taxes and no taxes actually? But when Donald Trump decreases the taxes, they can't even credit him with that. I mean, give the guy a small bit of a break. He did a lot of things that deregulated the business environment from his first days in office. That was at the start of his presidency, when he cut all that red tape, that bureaucracy that unleashed the American economy. And that's where it started to pick up. It didn't just happen because it happened, it happened because he had to do certain things. And now the only argument would be, well, he wants to put up a border fence. But even libertarians recognize the idea of statehood, state territory. This is a state. So, what is the foundational function of a state? At minimum, there needs to be some intervention, right? What is that minimum intervention? Security of its people at the top of its list. That is the function of it, the functioning of a state, a government in the state. That's why I get a bit antsy when someone refers to South Africa as a nation. Like I get why they do that, but we're not essentially a nation like
No, we're more
the
like a family of nations, really, that share a state.
yeah, like if you know the definition of a nation, or if people know the definition of a nation, we don't fall into that category. I think the Japanese people are one of the only societies that truly fall into the category of a nation. Um, so when they push back against these, oh, the state, and you can't have these border walls, and I'm just like, he's trying to get rid of problems in the country regarding crime, regarding various things in society that are a consequence of illegal immigration. That's all he wants to do. He's not saying that people are not allowed to come to the USA. You can go to the USA at any time you want to go, so long as you do it in the correct manner. That's all he's saying. He's not saying that there should not be a free flow of movement. There can be one within legal parameters. So to me, libertarians are extremely, highly disingenuous when they use that argument against Donald Trump and say
I think
the
they're
guy.
scared. I think they're scared. They're scared of their reputations, you
Mm,
know? Um, and some of them actually believe some of the well-repeated fallacies that you hear about Donald Trump being aggressively against the institutions of the Constitution. But the
mm,
people who are talking about ditching all of the checks and balances are the Democrats.
mm,
They're openly talking about getting rid of all of the mechanisms that have been working so far.
mm,
You know, and you know what it makes me think of is actually I don't know if you're much of a fan of Formula One, but do you remember when Michael Schumacher was really dominating the race? They just started changing rules in order to make it harder for him to win and to make it less of a match of skill until eventually, you know, he lost his winning streak, and you sort of
mm.
see the game getting rigged. You know,
Mm,
every time the left loses, they think, well, how can we transform the system so that this doesn't happen again? And
they
anytime the
change
right
it.
loses, they just go home.
Mm,
It's But that's the
No, but
West for you. The
I
Western
mean,
world is,
today was a classic example of where you saw how disingenuous these punditries are on Twitter. The man literally said he's going to the Supreme Court, literally using a constitutional mechanism to back up his claims. He never said that he's declaring victory. He merely said he believes that they won, but they are going to the courts to sort
yeah.
this issue out. He's using a constitutional mechanism. How is that anti-constitution? You would be a totalitarian if he said, we won, we're gonna have a celebration and we won the election. That would be totally authoritarian, right? Because you'd be
Mm.
subverting democracy. But
Yes.
if he gets his papers handed to him in court and said, listen, yeah, you lost the election fair and square, get over yourself, then he has to accept the will of
Mm.
the people as
But you
being.
understand now that it's no longer a game of law. It's a game of
Mm,
power, and
mm,
people who cross the internet, cross international power systems,
mm,
they can have very short lifespans.
mm,
Um, and I mean, we've all, for example, Jeffrey Epstein and so on, and you see the amount of money that gets shuffled back and forth amongst people at this level, and
mm.
I sort of wonder if anyone will ever know what goes on over the next 80 days. I think that it'll be one of the darkest and most invisible political battles. Um, and we're just going to be sealing the ripples on the surface, as the big fish fight under there.
Yeah, American politics is something else to talk about on another time. I mean, we didn't come onto this
Yeah.
um, chat to talk about American
Ach,
politics, but
yeah.
it's just like, the
But
nuances of
yeah, but that kind of murk is kind of usual. Hey, I
mm,
mean, how much of day-to-day politics in South Africa do you see? When I chat to someone from who's worked in civil service or who's worked in security or policing or has worked in journalism or anything,
mm,
there's stuff that they know they can't say because there's all these it'll attract dangerous attention, or maybe they just won't be believed, or whatever. And uh, the shape of things in South Africa seems to me to be very, very different from the kinds of mental tools we use to talk about them. We talk about laws, and we talk about the constitution, we talk about elections,
mm,
and we talk about property rights
mm.
and things like that. And the reality is a far more animal environment than that. It's far darker, far much more corrupt, far more violent.
And what stood
Um,
out to me, like speaking about, the way people speak about politics, what stood out for me about what John Steenhuisen said in his acceptance speech was, oh no, I think it was his campaign speech, whatever speech he made prior to winning. He said that we need to actually start cultivating an environment of stop living in these social media bubbles and being liberal activists on social media. It's not
yeah,
going out.
meet face to face.
Face to being real activists. Like if you want to convince someone, you need to persuade them face to face. And that to me was, it made a really good point, and it made an indictment on what the community of free thinkers have been doing for so long in South Africa, because it's inconceivable that individuals in society like myself would have not changed my mind had I been convinced face to face. But nobody was willing to come do that. Somehow along the line, I found my way out of that dark abyss of socialist rhetoric. Um,
Mm.
but if someone came to me and spoke to me about the issues, I would have been convinced. If you went toe to toe with me on issues and forced me to go read up a little bit, because I do, if like I don't win an argument, I'm probably going to go read up the entire night trying to disprove your argument so that I can come back. But in that process, sometimes you learn something and you're like, maybe my argument wasn't as good as I thought it was. I was just making arguments that I've heard. I'm not making arguments that I truly know of. So there wasn't that interaction happening, and I hope that interaction will happen more, not just from the DA per se, but from civil society groups, organizations um, that say they are the bastions of free thinking, and which they probably are because the things they write and publish are really good. But the ordinary man on the street is not going to read a 300-page report that has eloquent language and beautifully written and well said. That was a perfect speech. People don't care about perfect speeches. That's primarily why they elected Donald Trump. The man doesn't make um, beautiful speeches that have a minuscule of insight on foreign policy, but he speaks to the heart of the issue. He will name the issue illegal immigration. Like
Yeah.
everything we talk about in dissertations online, he speaks about off the cuff, and everyone understands the issue without knowing, the implications of fiscal conservative policy.
Oh,
Donald Trump,
I think he knows a fair amount. I mean, if you
I think he knows the communication of it is
yeah,
really good. He's that kind of person that you could have a conversation with, not
Zuma
someone
was
who
very good with that. Zuma was excellent with that.
precisely. And I think Julius Malema, to an extent, he
Oh,
does really
he's a
well.
genius. No,
He does really well
Malema's a genius.
communicating.
I'd never say anything less. Um, but he has a very narrow band of expertise.
No, I mean, obviously the ideas are ones that we don't agree with, but there
Yeah.
are some politicians in South Africa who know how to get a crowd going, not just in terms of screaming and singing, but they know how to capture an audience. Um, and maybe that can't be taught politically. You can't be taught to be like that. I wouldn't consider myself someone like that, but I would be able to identify someone like that and be able to push them into where they need to be pushed into because I recognize that we need that. We need someone who can just get in touch with people, whatever way it is they get in touch with people, they do it. Um, but that's the successes of these individual leaders that they're able to just connect. But now you have libertarian thinkers who have brilliant ideas. I'm not discounting their ideas, but they are
I know how to
maybe
talk to the people.
they don't identify with people movements like Brexit was a people's movement. It wasn't primarily, yeah, it was pushed by politicians, but it was politicians that could identify with what people were pushing. I mean, Nigel Farage is maybe not the best politician that you want to follow or a role model, but the guy knew how to speak to his voter base regarding an issue of Brexit. That guy was actively campaigning for Brexit for years, and he pushed Cameron for the referendum. And Cameron was like, you know what? I know more than you about politics, so I'm going to give you this referendum. That's David Cameron's biggest mistake. He fell into the trap, and he
Yeah.
thought he knew more than the people, and he thought, okay, I'm so smart. I came from Oxford University. Um, Nobody's going to vote for this, and boom, they voted it. They exited, and David Cameron had mud on his face, and he had to resign. Even
But
though I
it's
like Cameron.
this is the thing. When you start applying this, this is the Western world where everyone plays by a certain set of rules.
Mm,
And you look at how American politics was conducted in public until Donald Trump came along, and it's a very, very different kettle of fish.
mm,
And I think you can see the same in South Africa. The ANC, while they're comfortable with their lead, have been well. I mean, they've done awful things, but they've fallen shy of doing anything egregious or openly violent to members of the opposition. They haven't
mm,
done anything like that since the wars with the IFP.
mm,
But now that they're heading towards electoral defeat, they're starting to pull funny things out of the bag. They're changing the rules of the system. They're doing
mm.
electoral reform. They're talking about confiscating the property of minorities. They're doing all kinds of things like this, consolidation of power. And what my question would be to you, because for me, I see an extremely bleak future. One of the reforms to the electoral system that they've mentioned is allowing people who are not resident in an area to vote in it.
That that's basically. Are you speaking about the ANC doing this?
Yes, they're going to centralize power in the IEC. They're going to allow people to vote wherever they want
Or
during the
that's to
municipal
get the Western
elections.
Cape. That's to get the Western Cape because they know they're not going to take the Western Cape
Right.
anytime soon.
But then the question is, if they pull this off, what do you think the solution is?
I know where you're going
What's
with
the
this.
response?
I know where you're going to, but I think South Africa's response cannot be one of just sitting back and taking the punches because
Yes.
for a number of years now, politicians from the opposition has allowed the ideas of expropriation without compensation to take root in our society because it wasn't a very popular idea a few years ago. People actively rejected it. Even people on the other side who are now supporting it rejected it. Some of the media actually rejected it. They were asking questions like, "How can it work? How can it seriously work?"
See,
But
they're
now,
asking the wrong questions. They're asking the wrong questions because they
but
didn't even
now,
ask if it was morally acceptable.
mm, but they didn't. They didn't have a go at it. They just thought, let's just leave it, and it's going to fizzle out
Yeah.
in the
They're
future.
scared.
And it's not going to. It permeates. It gets into, and once it's into the young population, it's over because you're only a generation away from significant change. And the generation that the EFF was preaching to are now of voter age. They are of age where they can make their mark in the South Africa's elections, and that's what we don't recognize. Sometimes it's important to say that to not focus so much on consolidating a voter base as opposed to fighting for the minds of the next generation. That's one of my missions primarily in this dark world of South African politics because the battle is going to be won and lost in the next generation. Those who are in school who have been taught critical race theory um, are the ones that's going to vote in coming elections. 2024, you bet a lot of
Yes.
them are going to be of voting age. And if we're not
Yo,
actively fighting and changing their minds and showing them that, listen here, these things are not practical. I remember a time
I go practical. They're evil.
they're evil, but
Sorry for getting jumping in there.
so, like, I remember a time when I was a debater at high school, and when you would debate on policies, they would actively, like, debating was more about liberal minded policies, like free markets, this is going to work, the Chinese system doesn't work. Today, you would be shocked what's happening in the debating world in South Africa. You are pushed down a rabbit hole of critical race theory, and if you don't argue that, you're probably not going to win the debate. You're probably not going to win the debate if you don't advocate for a socialist outlook. And for years,
National socialist, shall we
in
say?
in the debating world, it's a fact, it's a wide known fact, even though people don't say it, is that if a team is going to advocate for the socialist like ideas, they're probably going to win the debate. And that started to become a frustration for me in that setting because you'd argue for something that they would see as no, that is fascism, when in actual fact that's not real fascism. Fascism is on their side, but they've misconstrued the idea so well that young people start believing it. um, if you look at these letters or these essays being now published, uh, it was reported in the media. I won't say anything specific about it, by debaters in the countries, essays being published. People who look like you, for instance, are advocating for outright socialism. Strip away the land, strip away.
Yeah, but the thing is, they think they're not going to be murdered.
They don't think
They
it's
really think that they'll be invited into the bosom of the nation as equals, which is a lie, of course, because accompanying the socialist ideology is,
mm,
of course, very strict racial ideology. And I'm
mm.
sure you've come across the like the double-edged blade of Biko blackness and how it can welcome you while you're an ally, and then there's a certain distance that you have to keep from the core.
But it's definitely that's a big part of it. But it goes to the heart of what they are. what they are doing is that if they capture a person at a very young age, if you teach them something at a very young age, it's very hard to re-persuade or unpersuade someone of something that has become so ingrained in their identity, their knowledge, dating back to some years in their high school years when they learned this. And they genuinely start believing it because they, again, receive this confirmation bias feedback loops in society, and they genuinely believe that society is racist. I've had white liberals fight me the hardest on social media.
Mm.
And they would tell me how oppressed I am. And I'm actually so oppressed, I don't even see it. I mean, that to me is it's the first time in my life that I've experienced something that I'm experiencing in 2020.
Yeah, it's
And this is not
Groucho
on Twitter.
Marx. It's like Groucho Marx. It's
This is
complete
not on
comedy.
Twitter. These are young people in the suburbs, white young people in the suburbs sending me DMs on Instagram, arguing with me that I don't understand what socialism is. I don't understand that it is about equality, that it is about prosperity of everybody. I mean, it to me that is one of the most sad things that we've allowed to happen,
Yeah,
because we've allowed young people to become so poisoned. But those are the people I speak to. I mean, yes, Twitter is cool and nice and everything. Um, it's got people who've already have ingrained ideas about society. So that's not my focus. My
yeah.
focus is with younger people, and any politician or political commentator needs to jump on this because the Americans can teach us a lot. American commentators can teach us a lot about what we are doing very wrong in this country. They are literally all over the place on every social media app because they understand that it's about young people. It's not about the generation who've already made up their minds. They know who they're going to vote for. You don't need to reconvince someone who's already been convinced. You need to convince someone who's been poisoned or is about to be poisoned, and you need to tell them that freedom is the only solution to all of society's problems. And even that, they're like, they would say things like the Heritage Foundation is a foundation of corporate capitalism. So you can't listen to them because they're advancing the ideas of the greedy capitalists. And I'm so shocked by it because studies are inherently unbiased. They don't care about whatever rhetoric there is. They just look at where.
Ooh. Well, that they're not going to buy that argument, I'm
No,
afraid. I
they
think
won't. They will
they
reject it outright. They will tell you, no, that's not the case. But obviously, there are different ways to communicate with younger people as opposed to adults. Um, and sort of sometimes you need to become more empathetic as opposed to antagonistic with them,
yeah,
because you need to see their point and you need to understand where they are coming from, and you need to respect their point, and when you do that, they start to respect yours. And then they come back to you and then they tell you, hey, I've actually changed my mind. I've had about in the last few months, I've changed so many young people's minds who were socialist outright. They even had this little, what is this Soviet Union, the hammer and the sickle thing
oh
on their
yes,
profile images, um, all over. And they told me, I mean, I get messages and people are telling me, South Africans, that hey, I actually agree with you now on a lot of the things I disagreed with you with.
yeah.
And that to me is the most satisfying thing that I could ever do in South Africa. But obviously we need to use different methods of doing it, because of what we are in at the moment, the restrictions of movement and all these things. Schools are not operating the same anymore. Like, you can't host events, you can't do etc. So you need to use every other method possible to start convincing people of your point of view empathetically. And what we have too much of the time is political pundits stuck in the hole of Twitter, and they are just sending feedback loops to each other, fighting each other, when there's a whole generation being lost. And that saddens me. But that's why I've decided to, that's what I'm going to do.
And
I
so
need to
you'd say the future is then on platforms like Instagram to a greater
all
extent.
over the place, wherever they go. It's not specifically Instagram. If another platform comes around and all these people are hyping it up, all these young people, we need to be there. That's that you need to adapt to your circumstance. But obviously, we need to be in the schools. We need to be every single place that young people are. We need to be on university campuses. Liberals, or whatever they want to call themselves in South Africa, are very scared individuals because they sit in a bubble, in a group together, and they would just like feed off each other, but they won't actually ever express their ideas. And a lot of the people who I've discovered are actual liberals I knew about, but they never spoke to me about these things. So I'm like, why did it, if you knew that it's so dangerous, why didn't you try to convince me? And that's the weak mindedness that is so pervasive. Well, not really weak mindedness. I just think it is um, this ignorance of how we need to communicate better with younger people that, you need to give the EFF their dues. They manage to rally younger people on university campuses like no other political party could do.
Because they
They,
create
they
controversy as well, don't they?
creating controversy, but they do it in a way that they know works. Um, and they are taking up that space. The other political parties have been reduced to reactionary movements. They are not
Yeah.
even the front runners on issues. They don't
They
run
don't make
issues.
the accusations. They don't push their ideas. They're
They
always
don't push
trying to
the
say,
narrative.
well, that won't work and that won't work. Yeah.
So it becomes about reaction as opposed to driving specific things that need to be part of the conversation in civil society. And that to me is a massive gap in South Africa. Um, like I get so many of the people who follow me, younger people who follow me, tell me that why don't we have more of you in South Africa? And I tell them we have so many of like people who know more than me, all stuck on Twitter. They're just there, but they're not communicating to the right channel. And it's not just like if something comes along, like I said, if another platform comes along tomorrow that overtakes Twitter, etc., you need to be there because that's where the young people are. And if we're not taking up these spaces, we are going to be continuously on the losing end of the divide because now we find ourselves in a position where we have to speak against land reform, land expropriation without compensation.
Yeah, we're
Um,
reacting to it instead of saying we want to be free, go
exactly,
away.
exactly. Things like constitutionalism, um, to me, like a lot of those in the middle and the center, perhaps, seem to be a little bit like I think you can make your opinion a little bit more exciting than what it is because it does seem like the ideas that they're pushing is a little bit boring. I wouldn't be like the only reason I'm interested in
Mm.
it because I know they're speaking the truth. I know they're highly educated individuals, but
Yes.
they haven't become they haven't become people of the people or people's people rather. Um, they rather have become super intellectual and rightfully so, like they probably worked really hard for it at university.
Mm.
Um, but if it's not creating value for people on the ground, then what are we truly doing? We're wasting our time, spending so much energy arguing with a
Mm.
Twitter bot who's programmed probably to say things to you. And then you arguing like a maniac on Twitter, like going crazy, trying to I don't know do what because number one, being antagonistic to someone is not going to convince them. It's just going to make them more polarized against your idea. Um, but we do this. Highly intellectual people do this. Commentators in South Africa, and it's a shame because
Mm.
we're wasting our brains on things that don't matter at all.
Mm.
Um, that's why I think that Johnson has its call for getting out there for real. I don't know if you know an organization called Turning Point USA.
Oh, no, yeah.
One
Yeah,
of
I'm
the
aware of them.
largest conservative student movements. It is the largest
Mm.
conservative student movement
But they don't
anyway.
really push conservative ideas anymore.
They're more like
They move it. They're about moving the Republican Party to the left to capture control of left-leaning people, people who've got
no,
left-leaning
I think
cultural
I
ideas.
think I think maybe you're thinking of another organization.
Yeah,
But
no,
the
no, no. Turning Point with what's that lady? Candace Owens was a big supporter of
Candace
that.
Owens and Charlie Kirk.
Yeah, and
But
Charlie Kirk.
anyway,
Yeah,
what they've done, they only started in 20s after the election, I think.
yeah. So
That's
they're
when they
supporting what would have been a far left position 10 years ago. Um,
classical
but
liberalism essentially. But republicanism, they all about Trump, Trump, Trump. They're going crazy
yeah,
at the moment on Twitter about the election. But anyway,
mm,
what they've done is they've done something so significant. It's to high school students, university students turning up to events in large numbers, sitting in suits. Like, in what country, in what society do you have people who listen to Nicki Minaj or all these types of cultural things,
mm,
coming from this background, turning up to an event, a political event in suits, and taking it very seriously? Very young people at
mm.
massive of level, like in a
They're very
mass.
effective. I'll give them that. They're very effective.
That's what we don't have in South Africa. We don't have things like that. The only people taking up that space at the moment, even though it's like in a different way, is the EFF. They're targeting young people because they know that that's where the future of the elections is. They don't care if they're not the government today. They're building for when, they build up a sizable majority to be able to do it. So, like, it becomes all these, missed connections because we're trying to, now it's my money, now we need to save the group running away, and now we
Mm.
need to, we're all over the place being reactionary,
Instead
and
of pushing, yeah.
it doesn't need to be that. It can just be, let you, like, if you say that you're a classical liberal, then consolidate your ideas, know what it is, limited government, individual freedom, and whatever else it is, and advocate for it on a mass scale. But now you get into these tough wars of this kind of market system and that kind of and I'm just like, you're losing people every day the more you
The
fight
second you're
about
getting into the weeds, you lose them. So
these
to
pedantic
round
politics.
this up a little bit,
Hmm.
I think I think one of the big things that you've highlighted here, not just for people who are on social media trying to get attention and public
Hmm.
commentators, but for
Hmm.
politicians alike, is to sort of get down and smell the roses a bit, to come out of that intellectual bubble, out of your class, and learn to speak to ordinary people and to young people who aren't affiliate, aren't that well acquainted with high detail economics or philosophy or whatever, and to bring them into the light a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just it's needed in our country, and it's by time that we have someone that's pioneering this stuff, not just from, yes, we need grassroots people that start their own things, but at the moment we just have too many clusters of things all over the place, and no one's actually pioneering anything at the moment. Um, but hopefully we can change that and make politicians realize that there is significant power, or not power, but there is significant support for ideas of freedom and free speech and all these things among a sizable chunk of the voting population and those that are going to be voting in the future. Because at the end of the day, if you are thinking about becoming the national government, then you need to rally people based on ideas and not particularly the identity. But the only way you do that is if you get out there. And I mean, reaching out to politicians is one of the most toughest things imaginable. Reaching out to people of political influence is not difficult in that you can't reach them. It's difficult to,
Hold them.
um, I don't even want to say hold them. It's it's difficult to make them realize um, how important these specific avenues are. Like saying that we know that we are going to lose voters um, from senior politicians is not a particularly encouraging thing, because then what are you doing? Because no political movement aims to lose voters. No political movement concedes that, okay, we are going to lose voters, so it is what it is. So if politicians in the mix are saying these things, then that is a worrying sign for the rest of South Africa, because South Africa is going to go down and like either one path or the other. We're either going to become a society destroyed by itself, which self implosion is happening under the weight of socialist doctrine, or we are going to rally people who don't necessarily turn out to vote, but are concerned about these issues, who want to be part of something bigger, because there are a lot of people that genuinely say, I want to support a political party, but Rian, I never knew that the DA pushed these things. That to me is the most shocking part.
They
Most
don't
of the
know.
people I talk to
Just
know
simple information.
they never knew these things, and they're like, they never knew this. And I'm like, then what are the politicians busy doing? If you're earning millions of rands sitting in parliament, um, who are you representing? What, like, because if you're not
Well, it's easy
representing,
to divide people on race than to divide them by policy. Policy is much more detailed than color.
yeah. So I mean, it's just like you. I think it's by and large our parliamentary system that allows politicians to get away with this thing of, in the United States, you're held accountable directly by the people. You know, you need to be directly elected. You need to run through primaries. You need to, there is a direct accountability. Yes, there are advantages and disadvantages of those systems as well. In the UK, there's also direct accountability to your constituency. We don't have that in South Africa. It's a foreign concept, but it doesn't mean that we can't hold specific people to account.
Yeah.
But it's just like, because we don't have that, our politicians get away with doing so little. Because if you're a politician in the Republic of South Africa representing constituency, and you have 200 followers on Twitter, what are you doing? I'm not saying that Twitter is sacrosanct, Twitter, the followings are sacrosanct, but it just means that your communication channels are so weak that you are not even getting engagement from an even smaller,
Yeah.
compact of society. Um, Tweeting about runs and football, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with doing that if you are a politician, but to me, that's an insult, because South Africa is busy being destroyed, and we have politicians tweeting about what they're going to eat for dinner tonight, or you
Mm.
have politicians tweeting about the football game, or giving us score updates. That's why we have EA Sports. That's why we have the Premier League accounts. We don't need you to be telling us the goal line score. If you're a politician in the Republic, if you are a politician in the National Assembly, that's not your place to be doing things like this. And
Okay.
I'm not just speaking to ANC politicians cooking food, acting like Master Chef when you should be learning about economics. I'm speaking about politicians across the aisle.
Dacha
In
and Das Kapital ruling our financial policy.
that- that's too much of a boring and inadequate book to waste your time reading anyway. But
Yeah, I
anyway,
know. Do you know it's funny? It's funny. I actually have it here. I've got all three volumes.
I've got one volume, but I'm just like, I'm probably not gonna read it. Just I
Yeah,
read notes about it, but it just looks too dense and too much.
it's
But
it's,
anyway,
it's not very exciting. But yeah, I mean, look, I think at the end of the day, what we're going to what we're going to have to face is we're going to have to learn to use this. And me, I'm very rusty. I've never been very good with online and with electronic communication. I'm very much a boomer in that way.
mm,
But
I mean, you don't need to be. You're not a politician, but the
no,
politicians out there who could see this, perhaps. Shame on you for tweeting about the Premier League soccer
Uh,
scoreline.
Focus.
When South Africa is being pillaged into food insecurity and when the economy is being destroyed. And this I say to politicians across our, even on the side I support, I won't name names. I'm not about that life, but they know who they are. They sit on Twitter, and I do complain about them in private circles because, like, I'm obviously not going to call you out on something so minor, but
Trivial.
you're trivial as that. But
Mm,
it just speaks to what you are there actually for. Like, it's not the time. It
mm,
was never the time. Not even in countries where the economies are doing well. Could you
mm.
imagine if Donald Trump's press secretary was tweeting about the scoreline of a netball match or a scoreline of the soccer in the Premier League? The
Yeah.
outrage.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that'd be no good. That'd be no good. That'd
but
be
in
very
South Africa,
unprofessional. They'd be fired.
and in South Africa, no, they just put a little disclaimer in the bio. I'm tweeting in my personal capacity. No, you are a public representative.
Yeah,
You don't
that's true.
have a personal capacity. You have a public life. So put in a disclaimer in your Twitter bio. I'm tweeting in my personal capacity, and these are liberals across the board as well doing this. Tweeting in my
Yeah,
personal capacity, no, sir or ma'am. You are tweeting as a public representative, representing people who are going hungry and you feel it's okay to tweet about your runs or whatever you are doing. But
mm.
yeah, that's just a little personal conflict thing that I have with these politics.
Well, on that note, I'm afraid I'm going to have to close the stream. But it's been wonderful talking to you, Riaan. I think you've given us a lot of insight into public communications, um, and I'm glad to have had you on.
Thank you so much.
All right. Good night, everyone.